Before I start the video, I want to give a big shout out to Carter Mosley, who gave me a huge donation on Patreon. Thank you so much. Now let's start the video.
Welcome to the world of Tales from the Trip.
It was Friday night. I had just managed to obtain 10 hits of blotter, and this was the first time I would be trying LSD. I was very excited at the time and couldn't wait to try it. I had done extensive research beforehand, and on this particular Friday night, I really thought I was ready to escape reality. Little did I know what was in store for me later that night. So the night progressed, and I invited a few friends over to my house. For the purpose of this story, we're going to call these people Jack, Kate, Tim, and Ben. Kate had also done a bit of research and was ready to try it as well. It was just going to be her and I tripping, while everyone else was just going to be hanging out and trip-sitting, and making sure we stayed under control. So the time came when we were ready to try it. I handed her a hit of blotter and took one for myself, and we both popped them in our mouths. We then decided to go watch TV while we waited for it to kick in. It seemed to take an eternity. After about 2 hours, I called a friend of mine and asked him what the deal was. He insisted that I just keep waiting, so I did. About 10 minutes later, Kate claimed she could feel it. I, however, could not. About 15 minutes later, I began to feel it as well. It came on slowly. My thoughts seemed to wander wherever I would let them go. Everything I touched had a very interesting feeling to it. Some of the things I touched felt really uncomfortable. I picked up Ben's keychain and stared at it in amazement at all of the colors for about 5 minutes. Then it started feeling really odd and like it was cutting into my hand. I instantly threw it down on the table. While Kate was already tripping hard and had went into the other room, I wasn't quite all the way there yet. I went to see what she was up to, and she kept going on about snakes for the next half hour, and how the room was filled with snakes and the snake gods. At this point, I was enjoying myself and having a really good time, just laughing about everything. The smallest things seemed hilarious. For the next few minutes, I was just fucking around with Kate while she was going on and on about snakes and kept unplugging her laptop cord, which for some reason was hilarious at the time. I was really enjoying myself. I just felt like fucking around with everyone. I was there on the ground, screaming and yelling, "Ben! Ben!" Then he would come into the room, and I would go completely silent. Then he'd walk back into the living room, where the other trip-sitters were, and I'd scream and yell his name again. This went on about 3 more times, until he finally just got sick of my shit and started ignoring me. I had some really crazy visuals, the most noticeable being when I looked at people's faces. While watching someone talking, their face would kind of morph and get larger and smaller. Their expression would also constantly change. This was quite amusing. At this point, both of us were tripping quite hard and nearing peak. We were laying on the ground and just having a good time. At this point, one of my trip-sitters decided that he had to try it after watching how much fun we were having. I kept telling him no, but he didn't listen. He went to the kitchen and grabbed a hit, then threw the money at me a bit later. A little while after, I found out that every person in my house had done the same thing. They all wanted to try it, so they took a hit without my approval. I started panicking. They were treating this drug that they had never researched before like it was something small like weed or alcohol. Tim even claimed it was no big deal and it's just a drug you chill out with your friends. Oh, how wrong he was. I was starting to freak out. Thoughts were racing through my head. I kept thinking, I'm losing control here, and kept thinking how terrible it was that we had no trip sitter to keep anyone under control. Then I started freaking out about the fact that it was my house and that if anything got broken, my parents would kill me. From this point on, I could not enjoy the trip. I was panicking and beginning to sweat. Everyone was tripping, and there wasn't a single sober person in my house. People were all over the place, doing God knows what, and I was really not enjoying myself. I became very hot, so I decided to go outside to cool off. We went up on the pool deck outside my house. Everyone else came with me. I kept asking them who hadn't taken it, but I kept being assured by everyone that each person there had done it. This just made me freak out even more. Tim tried to calm me down, which worked for a little bit. We laid there for a little while, reminiscing about the classic scene in The Pirates of Silicon Valley, where Steve Jobs takes LSD. We discussed it for a while and talked about how amazing it was that they made all those computers. This doesn't make any sense to me as I'm typing it, but at the time, we all thought it made perfect sense. The pool deck had an amazing unique feel to it, as did anything else I touched, and my vision was filled with colors. I was finally starting to enjoy myself again for a little while, but it was short-lived. Kate and Ben had run off, and everyone was just being very loud outside. I started worrying again. A bit later, I felt too cold outside, so we all eventually made our way back in. It wasn't but a minute later that the doorbell rang. Tim went and answered the door. It was the cops. They wanted to talk to me since I lived at the house. I was panicking again. I could hardly even talk. I went outside to speak with the officer, who said they had gotten a welfare check call. I kept trying to convince the officer that everything was fine and that no one had done anything. I also kept saying that I did not want them searching my house under any circumstances. I couldn't think very straight at the time, as I was at the peak of my trip now. I just kept repeating that I didn't want them searching my house. This officer kinda gave up on me for a while another officer came out to talk to me. This officer tried to talk to me on a much more personal level. He said how he knew we were on something, and that his guess was acid. I didn't say a yes or a no, but my facial expression did change when I realized he knew what was up. He continued talking to me on a personal level, and started going on about how he used to sell dope at my age. Then he started talking about how he turned his life around, and that I needed to do that as well. At this point, the other officer came back outside and started questioning me again too. I felt so intimidated and scared at the same time. I was tripping hard, and I could not handle the situation at all. I felt like I was 2 inches tall, and the officers were giants. I felt like I was a small bug about a second away from being stomped on. They also questioned my friends in a different area away from me. My friends had told them that I had sold it to them. I tried to weasel my way out of everything, but I was tripping so hard that I just couldn't handle it. I don't remember a whole lot of what happened next, but the officers had entered my house, and they found the remaining 5 hits of blotter, which I had left in a DVD case, on the kitchen counter. I felt destroyed. I knew in my mind that this was the end. At this point, they had also called an ambulance to my house, as well as backup police officers. My entire cul-de-sac was filled with law enforcement. Since I was freaking out even more now, the police officer led me over to the ambulance so that the medical examiner could check me out. He said I would be fine and that I just had a really high pulse. Some of the police officers were enjoying themselves and fucking around with me at the time. I remember one officer telling me to go to another officer. Then when I got there, he would say, "What are you doing here? I told you to go over there." One of the officers who was talking to my friends inside of my house was talking about all the crazy things all my friends were saying, and how they were definitely gone. Eventually, one of the officers led me back to my front porch to help me get my shoes. I put them on, then I was put in the back of a police car. I felt 2 inches tall again. I began to feel very claustrophobic and started freaking out again. I kept looking out the window, and eventually, they let me out again for a while. They asked me a few more questions, then I asked if I could call my parents. At this point, the reality had really struck me. I knew how fucked I was. I knew I was being arrested, and I knew there was nothing I could do to get out of this. I called my father, crying to him on the phone and telling him how sorry I was for disappointing him. I went on and on about how I should have listened to him. After a while, the police officer told me to wrap it up, so I said my goodbyes, and he then took my phone as evidence. I was put back into the police car, and an officer got in and started it. We started driving to the police station. I had calmed down slightly, and I remember saying, "Damn," as the officer floored it once we got out onto the main road. Eventually we got to the police station, and I was led inside. I was still tripping and had trouble remembering what he was telling me to do. He led me down a hallway and had me sign some papers. Then he led me into a small holding cell. Once I was in the cell, I realized the severity of the situation again. The cell was a small room with bright lights, a mirror, a toilet, and a sink. I sat on the bench in the cell and just thought about everything and wondered how I got myself into this. I started crying and asking myself out loud, how could I do this? How could this happen? This talking to myself went on for probably an hour. Then I proceeded to stare at the floor of the cell, which caused me to see some very interesting visual hallucinations. I couldn't enjoy myself though. My mind was not in the right place. At this point, I just wanted to end the trip. I took a drink of water, then took a look at myself in the mirror. I looked terrible. I definitely looked like someone who was fucked up. I kept on having weird thoughts like, is this me? Is this who I am? Over the next couple of hours, I kept drinking water to help end my trip faster, and also went to the restroom a few times. Finally, the officer opened the cell, and I was let out. I was told that I would be going to the local juvenile detention facility. My heart sunk, and again, I realized just how much shit I had gotten myself into. I was put into handcuffs and shackles. Then I was led outside by 2 more officers into a white van. At this point, it was around 5 a.m., and I had not slept yet. I couldn't sleep though, as I was still tripping. I was put into the back of this van while the officers got in and began to drive. The juvenile detention facility was around 2 hours away, so they told me to try and get some sleep. I tried, but I couldn't. It was very uncomfortable sitting with handcuffs and shackles on. During the 2-hour drive, I had some very weird thoughts. I thought a lot about life and how these officers were just normal people who happened to have a job in law enforcement and how they all had their own families and their own problems. This was just their job. My mind wandered the entire ride there. Eventually, we got there. I was taken out of the vehicle and led to the door outside the facility. A very buff man was standing outside of it. The officers wished me luck and left me with this man, who then proceeded to yell at me like a drill sergeant. He made me repeat everything he said and started going over some of the ground rules of the facility. There was a yellow line taped down on the floor, and I had to acknowledge all the officers and request permission to cross it. This was very hard to do at the time, as I was still kind of fucked up and I hadn't slept in ages. Eventually, one of the guards led me into a room and had me shower, and then gave me prison clothes to change into. I couldn't believe I was actually in jail. After I finished my shower, he let me call my parents. I told them to get me a lawyer, and they agreed. That was the last I would hear from them. Eventually, I was led to a room with bunks and with other inmates. The next 3 days that I would remain in this facility would be the worst days of my life. The first day was the worst. I was still coming down from the LSD, and I was not allowed to sleep at all until 10 p.m. rolled around. Needless to say, I could hardly function during the day, and was completely exhausted by the time night came around. The facility operated like a standard jail. Asshole guards, terrible food, no rights, and nothing to do besides reading the rule sheet you were given. If you had good behavior, you could later be upgraded and be able to read the Bible. Then if you continued to have good behavior, you could check out a book. The 3 days I had remained in this facility were the longest days of my life. What was even worse was that all the kids in there were in there for real crimes like fighting and stealing. I was in there for a drug charge, a victimless crime. Every night before I went to sleep, I would think about how I was going to possibly get out of there and how long I would be in there. On the 3rd day, I was taken to court in another white van, along with a dozen other inmates that were scheduled for court that day. We got to the courthouse, and my case happened to be the very first one. My parents, my lawyer, and I all went to the stand. My lawyer did most of the talking, and eventually it was agreed upon that I should get out of the juvenile detention facility, but have house arrest for a month, and then 8 more months of probation. I was unhandcuffed and released to my parents. This is where my story ends. All this happened over one hit of LSD. My trip was a train wreck, a complete disaster. I later found out that all my friends had gotten off scot-free, not even charged or anything. I was slapped with over $1,000 of fees and now had to serve probation. I wasn't able to properly evaluate the drug, Erowid style, due to everything that had happened. Would I ever eventually try LSD again? I'm not sure at this point. If I did try it, it definitely wouldn't be at my house again. This experience took place in 1994. At that time, I had a polysubstance abuse problem for 5 years. Although I indulged vigorously in various psychedelics and stimulants, I had a fairly substantial heroin habit. I had maintained my addiction to heroin for 3 years with no major negative drawbacks. I held down a job, kept a roof over my head, and although I wasn't rich by any means, I never encountered any serious financial worries. I was using about half a gram of heroin on a daily basis. I had 2 very reliable sources, and many less reliable and trustworthy sources. In 1993, I moved to Perth, Western Australia. I had been to Perth many times previously for stays up to 6 months, so I knew the place very well. I traveled to Perth with a prescription of methadone. Before leaving the UK, I had been prescribed 40 milligrams a day by a doctor that I had assured I would be attending a methadone clinic in Australia. He prescribed me enough to last me 3 weeks. When I arrived in Australia, I quickly looked up a friend I knew that used heroin and was introduced to the scene there. I already knew the price of heroin in Perth was higher than the price in the UK. Unlike the UK, the vast majority, in fact, I would say probably all the heroin available, came from Southeast Asia and not Afghanistan. The heroin was white and did not need citric acid to become soluble in water. Also, the supply of heroin was far from constant. Droughts were very common. However, there was a large black market for pharmaceutical opiates, and I eventually found a middle-aged woman who was prepared to sell me her weekly prescription of Palfium. After 6 months went by, I was sick of all the trouble I was having trying to maintain my habit. I was also finding it financially difficult too, so I approached a methadone clinic. I started off being prescribed 45 milligrams of methadone daily. This climbed every second day until I was on 120 milligrams daily. On the 120 milligrams of methadone, I began to feel less and less interested to use heroin or illegally obtain pharmaceutical opiates. In this respect, the methadone was very effective. At the time, I was also prescribed alprazolam and temazepam. The rather chaotic lifestyle I had been following ceased, and life became far more manageable. In total ignorance, I really thought that going on methadone had been a really good idea, and I thought of methadone as a good thing. After being on the methadone program on a daily dose of 120 milligrams for about 4 months, I was involved in a fight and injured someone quite seriously. I was remanded in custody to a maximum security prison. Naturally, I was concerned that I continued to receive my daily dose of methadone. However, this was denied to me. I was shut in an observation cell in the hospital wing of the prison and given nothing but Stemetil to stop the inevitable violent diarrhea. As the methadone wore off, I began to feel almost indescribably bad, far, far worse than any other opiate withdrawal I had ever experienced. My eyes became fully dilated. I was sweating profusely, shivering, and vomiting. All 4 of my limbs felt like they had been broken in many places. I was writhing and groaning. I begged the prison nurse to give me codeine. Eventually, I was let out of the observation cell into the main hospital wing. I couldn't walk more than 10 steps without collapsing. It was relentless, day and night. There was no escape from the utter nightmare of this withdrawal. I spent 3 months in total on remand. I didn't sleep at all during this time. After a week of withdrawal in the hospital wing, I was put onto a unit in the general population. I became delirious from the constant torment and lack of sleep. Eventually, I slipped into a severe psychosis. I was hallucinating and totally paranoid. In my cell, I would have delirious delusions and hallucinations. I watched a television. I had no such thing in my cell. I learned on this television that Michael Jackson was in this jail too. I was visited by my dead grandfather. I experienced guards coming into my cell and telling me I was going to be murdered during association. Obviously, none of these things happened. Other prisoners became aware of the fact that I was psychotic, so I was put back in the prison hospital and put in a single cell with a huge window so that I could be constantly monitored by medical staff. At this point, I made bail. It took me about 2 months to start to feel fully recovered. In time, I beat the case against me on the grounds of self-defense. Since that time, it has become illegal for a prisoner who is remanded whilst on a methadone prescription to be denied methadone. I would say that methadone withdrawal is the most awful experience I've ever endured in my life. Methadone withdrawal is far more severe and prolonged than heroin withdrawal. I think it is very limited as a recreational drug, and its long half-life makes it potentially catastrophic if used in such a way because users may redose frequently as there is no noticeable peak effect. In short, it is in my opinion a horrible, potentially lethal drug with few, if any, beneficial applications. There are very many other drugs that can be used in the treatment of heroin addiction, one of which, of course, is pharmaceutical heroin. A methadone prescription is a more effective way of limiting your choices and controlling you than a curfew or electronic tag. It should come as little surprise that it was developed by Nazi scientists. If any substance can be called evil, methadone fully deserves to be. This experience was so radical, I still remember it vividly after 30 years. My friends came up on a pallet load of expired drugs from a hospital headed for the hazmat dump site. We went through the hard stuff, MS, Dilaudid, Dexoxin, etc. With a rip-roaring drug habit, I started digging through all the little bottles of unknown stuff. That's when I came across the vial of pure scopolamine hydrobromide used for compounding and formulation. The drug reference said it was used in over-the-counter sleep tablets, and I needed some sleep bad. I swallowed about a half a grain and injected another half grain. Big mistake. It was about 9 p.m., and I don't remember much of the next 12 hours. My stepson said I crawled around all night eating lint balls off the shag carpet and mumbled to myself. At times, I felt perfect, except I couldn't walk, and the hallucinations were so vivid, I thought they were real. I was so bad that my stepson helped me get to a payphone to call the ambulance, but the numbers on the phone were backwards, like in Russian. The fire department came and took me to the ER. My body was like on a PCP overdose, and I couldn't even stay on the exam bed, and I kept slipping off onto the floor. It was funny because I would go from a clear mind to talking to people who were not there. They shot me with Valium 3 times to no effect. My heart rate was over 200, and my mouth was so dry, I could not talk. The cops came, accused me of resisting arrest, and put me into a chokehold. After beating my butt right in front of the nurses, they took me to jail and tossed me into the rubber room. There, I kept seeing a detective shove his handgun into the cell and pull the trigger. Click, but no shot. He would laugh and pull his hand out. This happened over and over. Then I saw my grandma get thrown into the pen right across the hall, and I saw thugs rape her over and over. I was sure I could knock down the cell door and slam into it with all my weight over and over. I was screaming I would kill those punks and they were all pointing and laughing at me. It was 12 a.m. the second night. The watch commander opened the cell to check on me at change of shift. I leapt from the flat on my back like a cat and bit him so bad that he had to go on workers' comp and then retire. After that, they called me the biter. All this time, I was in a padded cell. I thought I saw pills all over the floor. I kept eating them, hoping to come down. I thought there was a bowl of Valiums in the middle. It was actually a crap hole in the rubber room. Gross. They took me upstairs the third day to a medical unit. I thought I had a long sword stuck down my pant leg. I was walking with a stiff leg, and the cops kept asking why I was walking funny. Over the next 12 hours, my toilet was singing doo-wop, my towel was Popeye's Kid Sweet Pea swinging around the bars, and I was stuck in a standoff between the Hells Angels and the Black Panthers. I must have killed a dozen men with my sword. The third night, I was afraid to move because I would set off a war, and I was right in the line of fire. I laid there frozen for at least 10 hours. All while this was happening, the Black Panthers kept throwing dead cats into my cell. The fourth morning, I had to go to court, so mental health interviewed me. I denied taking any illicit drug, knew who was president, what day it was, and where I was. I told them everything was fine, except they kept throwing dead cats into my cell. When I got back to my cell, I noticed I could see more clearly, was able to shave, had to threaten a fellow prisoner with beheading if he didn't give me a razor, and I went to court. I mustered every ounce of strength and told the judge it was all a big mistake. My wife had filed a police brutality report over the hospital incident, and they let me go. It took over a week and a lot of downers for it to wear off completely. I know what it is to be insane and come back. I don't recommend it. It all started in mid-November 2004. Being in study period with nothing to do, I decided to leave with my friend Neil to drink some beers at his house. Neil offered me some marijuana, but I declined, seeing as that I was being drug tested. When we arrived at his house, Neil smoked a few bowls of his weed, and I drank about 5 beers. We returned to school after the festivities were over and commenced to go to last period. I remained drunk until I got on the bus to go home. My friend John asked me if I wanted to chill at his house after school, so I got off the bus at his house. While there, I learned he had an assortment of various drugs available. I snorted 60 milligrams of Adderall to try and sober me up so that I could call and tell my parents my plans for the evening. After I called them, John told me that his brother was growing an angel's trumpet plant in the basement. Supposedly, it would make you trip for 3 days. We went down to the basement. I ate 3 leaves, and John ate about 2. We put on a movie, waiting for the trip to start. About 1 hour into the movie, I started to feel very tired, almost as if I were to fall asleep. We stood up and stopped the movie and attempted to get something to eat. I noticed that my motor skills were severely affected as I would reach out to touch the door, and it would take me several attempts before actually reaching the knob. I went to the bathroom to piss. I looked in the mirror and saw that my pupils were very dilated. I went out to tell John the exciting news about my pupils, and he looked at me and started laughing. We went up to his room to play video games. I tried to race the car, but I kept crashing into walls and other cars. At one point, his sister came into the room. Seeing as I had never met her before, I introduced myself to her in the best of my ability. Soon after this, I blacked out. My friend Chris, who does not use drugs, had just gotten out of work and came over to John's house to hang out. All memories from here on are told to me by Chris because I do not remember. John's mother came home and asked me if I wanted something to eat. I quickly said no in a panicked way. I kept calling his mother Mrs. Anderson, even though John's last name is not Anderson. We decided that I was too fucked up to be at John's house, so we went out and hung around Chris's car. I told John and Chris that I was going to look for my locker in the woods. They advised me against it, seeing as we were not at school. At this point, I remember my hallucination. I was at my school. Everyone had pale white clothes on and pale gray skin. The school was also black and white. My friend Drew, who used to be the drummer in my band, was the prevalent person that I remember from this hallucination. Chris told me as we were standing around his car that I was attempting to change the oil in my father's car, which was not there. We all got in his car, which was really there, and decided to go to the mall. On the way to the mall, while I was caressing the leather seats, we were stopped by the police. Apparently, one of John's neighbors had called the cops after observing me wandering in their backyard in a delusional fashion. The cops brought me down to the station. I somewhat remember being in the back of the police car and trying to stick my finger through the metal grating. The police called my parents, and they came down to the station. While they were there, I almost wandered into the road and got hit by a car. My parents brought me home. I don't remember the ride home, but I do remember when I got home, my father punched me in the face and was trying to get out of me what drugs I had taken. I told him I had to take a piss in the woods, walk down the porch stairs about 5 steps, and turn around and came back in. My father asked why I hadn't gone to the bathroom and got confrontational with him, saying that I did. My mother was on the phone, frantically trying to get from Chris what drugs I had taken. I remember looking over at the cabinet and seeing stacks and stacks of cereal boxes. I was also talking to people who weren't there in a frantic manner, and picking pieces of dog hair off the floor and playing with them and putting them back down. Eventually, I muttered Angel's Trumpet. My father, having read a book on Brugmansia and other hallucinogenic plants in college, decided that I needed to be brought to the hospital. I don't remember much of the ride there. I was trying to communicate with my parents, having forgotten once again that I had taken any drugs. I remember that after everything I had said, my mother would say things like, "What the fuck?" When I arrived at the hospital, I was hallucinating wildly. John's parents were doctors. While I was laying on the hospital bed, I thought I was in John's parents' bedroom, taking a nap. The doctors were asking me if I had taken any drugs that day. I said no. My parents told me I was reciting things to them, such as how to solve related rate problems in calculus and the chemical structure for glucose. I remember I was hallucinating that my calculus notes were written on the hospital curtain because of the strange patterns that were there. I also told my father that my blood was neon red because of the heart monitor on my finger. The doctors finally injected me with glucose and a chemical to counteract the Brugmansia. I stopped hallucinating and woke up in the bed thinking I was getting my wisdom teeth taken out. I spent all night in the hospital with my mother, saying foolish things such as, "I need to go to the bathroom in the woods." The hallucinations continued throughout the morning on the way home from the hospital. The road signs letters kept rearranging and changing. Eventually that night, the hallucinations finally diminished almost completely. In conclusion, Brugmansia fucked with my head. I know I'll never do it again.